Hello everyone, and welcome once again to Reverb. My name is Alex Helberg. Calvin Pollock is off this week. There's been a lot of attention paid to student protests and Palestinian solidarity encampments on college campuses across the United States over the past several weeks. From New York City colleges like Columbia and the City College of New York, to UCLA, UT Austin, the University of South Carolina, and University of Chicago, among many others. But one thing that we wanted to mention before getting into our interview today is that focusing solely on the protests themselves risks missing the broader solidarity movements that these protests represent. So to start off, it's important to acknowledge what these student organizing movements are protesting against. So, to put things in perspective, since the October 7th incursion of the border wall surrounding the Gaza Strip, in which Hamas fighters killed an estimated 1,160 Israeli people and took 250 people hostage, the Israeli military has been conducting a prolonged violent siege of nearly the entire territory in Gaza, including both bombing and ground infantry campaigns. This siege has involved the Israeli bombardment of critical infrastructure, most infamously hospitals such as Al-Shifa and Al-Nasser Pediatric, to name two of many, and the destruction of every university in Gaza. As of the time of this recording, anywhere between 30,000 and 40,000 Palestinian people in Gaza have been killed by the Israeli military, including an estimated 14,500 children, with some humanitarian agencies, such as Human Rights Watch, reporting that the Gaza Health Ministry may be undercounting the number of actual dead due to the destruction of its critical health infrastructure. A further 78,000 Palestinian people have been injured in Gaza, and more than 8,000 people have been reported missing. As I am recording this, the Israeli military is conducting a bombing campaign in Rafah, where nearly 1.5 million Palestinian people, more than half of Gaza's total population, have sought refuge from the total destruction of the rest of the Gaza Strip. Outside of the Israeli military's siege in Gaza, nearly 500 people, including 124 children, have been killed, and more than 4,800 injured by violence from the Israeli military and settlers in the occupied West Bank. The occupation of this territory by Israeli military and settlers has long been declared illegal under international law. In January of this year, the International Court of Justice stated that it was plausible that Israel had committed genocide in Gaza, and in a preliminary ruling ordered that Israel take steps to prevent genocidal acts by its military. The Israeli government has rebuffed the ICJ's orders by continuing to block or restrict critical humanitarian aid from reaching Gaza and escalating its military operations in the region. In response to this mass loss of human life and the devastation of civil infrastructure for Palestinian people, students at colleges and universities across the U.S. have established large, prolonged solidarity encampments in open spaces on their campuses, calling for their administrations to disclose their investment portfolios for their endowments and to divest their financial stake in any companies or entities that contribute to the Israeli government and military, including U.S.-based weapons manufacturers and defense contractors. To help us walk through the rhetorical and material implications of these protests, we're joined today by Olivia Wood, a lecturer in the English department at the City College of New York, who specializes in the rhetoric of social movements and queer rhetorics. In addition to her academic writing, which has been featured in the Routledge Handbook of Queer Rhetorics, the open textbook LGBTQ+ Studies, and the Journal of Multimodal Rhetorics, Olivia is also a contributing writer for Left Voice, focusing on labor organizing and higher education, among other pressing sociopolitical issues. Olivia, thanks so much for being with us here on Reverb.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. So, Olivia, can you start off by telling us a bit about what you have experienced as an observer, as somebody who has been around the various protest encampments across New York City? And particularly for our listeners who don't know, what are these solidarity encampments at these specific NYC colleges and universities advocating for? Are there any important differences or particularities across some of the different campus movements that you've been observing?
Yeah, so I went to Columbia on April 22nd. That was the Monday after I got back from the Labor Notes conference. There was a big faculty rally in solidarity with the students that day, and SWC, Student Workers of Columbia, which is primarily grad workers, but includes some undergrad folks, had asked folks from other universities to come out in solidarity. So we weren't able to enter the campus because everything was really locked down by then. But we had a small contingent of CUNY folks who got together and came outside. There was supposed to be an NYU group coming also, but their encampment started, I think, that day. So they were obviously busy there. So we couldn't really see inside to see the encampment or the rally. I just saw all that on Twitter afterwards. But some of the camp folks like came to the fencing to lead us in chants and things like that. There was a bunch of counter protesters and enough cops that they probably outnumbered the solidarity folks outside and also the counter
Oh my
protesters.
God. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, so that was Monday of that week. And then Thursday, the 25th, our encampment at CUNY, which was located at my workplace. And I guess I'll explain some of the acronyms. CUNY, City University of New York, 25 campuses all across the 5 boroughs. CCNY, City College of New York, is where I work. It's one of those campuses. So our encampment was at City College, but included students, grad workers, and faculty and staff from perhaps not all of the campuses, but certainly the idea was everyone from CUNY was converging here. So I was there for the start, walked in with everybody else and helped get set up. And then I was there for a lot of the day, every day, from that Thursday until Tuesday. Tuesday was the first day that I didn't go in. And we'll talk about
For
more of that
sure.
later, I
For
guess.
sure.
So it was, I mean, as people at other encampments have said, it was mostly really chill, mostly just hanging out, doing teach-ins, spending time with people, interspersed with chanting. I met coworkers who I've known for years, but only on email. People from 4C's Labor Caucus, who I didn't even realize were at CUNY. Someone came up
Oh,
to me and was like,
wow.
"Oh, you're Olivia. I know you from Labor Caucus." And so we started
No
having a
way.
conversation, right, about what to propose for the Labor Caucus panel next year at the
Oh, that is
encampment.
so cool.
It was amazing. And like meeting, I mean, I've worked at my job for 2 years, but I mostly only know the other full-time English faculty and a handful of the adjuncts, just because that's who I see. So also meeting a lot of my coworkers, both in the English department and from other departments, people whose names I recognize from their office plaques, but have never met, all kinds of stuff like that. So that was really wonderful. The weather was beautiful. There was some clash with public safety and fear of police involvement Thursday evening, but starting Friday to Monday, the police weren't on campus and public safety kept their distance, although certainly they were keeping an eye on things. Except they were very clearly setting up for future repression. Normally, anyone with a CUNY ID can come into any of the buildings. They stopped doing that. So for a while, it was City College only. Then it was City College faculty and staff only. And we have an open campus. So normally anyone can walk on. You only have the ID to get into the buildings. But they were setting up fencing around all of the entrances. And for most of the time, they didn't close it off. You could still walk in and out, but it was definitely set up for when they wanted to stop, then they would be ready.
Yeah, that feels like it kind of contravenes the ethos of City College, especially, which is supposed to be the people's campus in New York City, right? It is as a public university or public college right in the middle of the city that kind of seems to contravene their point. But I wanted to ask specifically because I know that, there has been a lot of talk specifically about the kind of demands that are being circulated at the camps. From your experience, are all of these kind of like univocal in what they are calling for, specifically for colleges and universities to divest their endowment holdings in US based weapons manufacturers, any other companies or entities that are in some way contributing to the apartheid and the current violence and genocide that's going on in Gaza? Could you talk a little bit about what do they seem to be calling for across these various encampments?
I think divestment is a shared demand across, if not all of them, then basically all of them. Transparency is a demand at some, but different colleges have different pre-existing levels of financial transparency. There's some, in a lot of them, there's some amount of like anti-repression, like reinstate any suspended students, drop charges against those who have been arrested. At Columbia, many people had already been suspended. Same thing at CUNY. We had 2 adjunct faculty members that I know of who are non-reappointed. In one case, forcibly by the college president, who, after he was reappointed by his department for a pro-Palestine speech. So we've had some of that.
Unreal.
I think what makes our CUNY demands, if not unique, then unusual, is there was a lot more other kinds of stuff. So the 5th demand for the CUNY encampment is a people's university. So going back to free tuition and providing housing, Metro cards, healthcare, other things like that to students, really drawing on our past. It used to have free tuition, and then also some of the demands from the 69 occupation at City College. And then some other of the CUNY specific demands were renaming the Colin Powell School, which is, I mean, named after Colin Powell,
Certainly.
and houses the social science disciplines. And then reinstating the Guillermo Morales and Asada Shakur Community and Student Center, which was established in the 80s and then dismantled in, I think, 2013, maybe 2012.
Wow. Seriously, that recently. That's
Yeah.
kind of incredible. Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate that because I think one of the things that sometimes gets missed in a lot of we'll talk plenty about the kind of misreportings of mainstream journalists of these encampments a little bit later on. But one of the things that I think gets missed kind of more generally is the way that a lot of these individual encampments and movements that are happening at individual institutions are also calling for very locally specific demands that are, paying homage to the history of a place like City College that, used to provide more or less kind of like a service for the community, kind of living up to that, the goal, the kind of idealized goal of a public university that is actually, inviting in the community and actually encouraging, people from the community to attend it. So I wanted to also ask then, because as a rhetorician too, obviously we are paying attention to these things on kind of, our level of looking at the not only the language, but also just the general like semiotics of this movement and the way that they are, using various forms of symbolic action to advance these goals and advocate for them. So could you talk a little bit about some of the more notable rhetorical strategies that you've seen student organizers using in their advocacy for some of these demands?
The first thing I noticed at Columbia and then also at City College is these really intentional allusions to the campus occupations of the 60s. So Columbia with their liberated zone banner, and then at City College in 69, there was a banner that said support the 5 demands, Viva Harlem U, because they'd renamed City College Harlem University or University of Harlem, depending on the banner.
Right.
And so for ours, they named 5 demands, like the number was very important, and then recreated that banner that says support the 5 demands. Instead of Viva Harlem U, it says Viva Palestina. And like even just the choice at Columbia when they were doing the building occupation to occupy the same hall that has been occupied at several times in the past, and other kinds of illusions like that. I've also seen at ours and lots of other encampments references to different Palestinians who have been killed. So renaming Hamilton Hall Hinds Hall. Lots of camps have had Rafat al-Arir memorial libraries. That's what they've named their collections of political literature. And there was some encampment, I just saw it on social media, that named their medical tent after a Palestinian doctor who refused to evacuate the hospital and stayed with his patients. Yeah, so that really got me. And then on a lighter note, the meme of the water jug has been embraced by, I think, a lot of encampments.
Yeah, can you tell us a little bit about this symbol and kind of how it has circulated?
Yeah, so originally it was from a video from Cal Poly Humboldt, which is a Cal State school, in which the students there were occupying a building from the very beginning, as far as I can tell, and had a clash with the police who were trying to force their way in, and someone hit a cop over the head with one of the giant like water cooler jugs, which was empty. The video went viral. The hip hop artist created a song about it, which is excellent. And shortly after, at our encampment, someone had made a poster that had a drawing of someone holding a water jug and said, by any means necessary. And I've seen similar images from a lot of encampments online. At, I think it's Arizona State, people put those water bottles upside down on the lawn sprinklers to capture the water and prevent them from being sprayed with all the water as an eviction tool.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I didn't know about that one. That's really incredible.
Yeah. And at City College on Tuesday, when the repression happened, someone else hit a cop with a giant water jug, and that ends less well than Cal Poly Humboldt. The person got arrested immediately after. But we did see the water bottle make another appearance. I've seen edits of that famous Malcolm X photo where he's holding a water jug.
Oh my God.
Yeah, it's really taken off as a joke, as a symbol of resistance, as a symbol of student creativity. And I think subtly solidarity with the other encampments, even though there hasn't been that much like direct coordination nationwide, certainly people are paying attention to what's happening with their counterparts at other schools.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was gonna I had this kind of sense, just from following this on social media, not being somebody who is in, a major metropole where these encampments are happening, that, that memes are still kind of an important part of, spreading solidarity across different campus communities. Because as we're talking about the kind of individualized demands that these campuses are making, there is this sense that there is also a kind of common reaction that they are all facing against. In many cases, that is police violence, police repression, and particularly in response to occupation as a protest tactic, which everyone at this point, at least if you're watching mainstream media or reading a lot of mainstream journalism, you might be led to believe that this is the first time buildings have ever been occupied in the history of college campus protests, that this is a completely without precedent strategy, which is particularly wild for places like Columbia, where specifically Hamilton Hall, right, was also occupied back in the 60s during the Vietnam War. So one of the reasons that I wanted to kind of ask about the movement from encampment to occupation, there seems to be a kind of distinction that some university administrators are making there, where, encampments are okay until they start crossing this line of disruption, however they want to constitute that to mean impeding the sort of business as usual of a campus community. And then occupation crosses a red line, right? When you occupy a space where otherwise it is perfectly acceptable for students to gather and congregate. When you decide to call that an occupation, all of a sudden that has crossed a line. UT Austin in particular, I think their president's statement used that as a primary justification for why the state patrol was called in to violently repress the students who were protesting there. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about at least your knowledge of, occupation as a kind of rhetorical strategy. I mean, just to kind of correct the record, to what degree does this have precedent actually at some of these different institutions, and what kind of message do you think that's sending?
I know the most about Columbia and City College. In addition to the same hall being occupied at Columbia in 68, my understanding is that it was also occupied sometime during the anti-apartheid protests then, and I'm sure other times as well. At
Right.
City College, folks occupied several buildings in 69, and then most recently, as far as I know, in 91. And my understanding is there were some other occupations in the 80s as well, but I haven't yet found documents describing what that situation was. And I think what's interesting is in the 60s, like the cops were called in well after the occupations began. That was allowed to happen for a while. At Columbia, they held a dean hostage, and still the NYPD was not called
Yeah,
in
that's right. I forgot
until
about that.
later. And at City College in 91, my understanding is that they were occupying my building that I work in, which it shocked me that they occupied it because it's very large with many entrances and exits, but I guess they did it for a while before finally the police were sent in there and to the other CUNY schools where occupations were happening to evict them, which is very different from what we just saw last week, where the way the president and the provost are telling the story is they decided that it was time to call in the police because they were afraid of not only one building occupation, but accessing the tunnels to occupy all of the buildings. And I say this to people and they're like, is this just like another like Hamas is in the tunnels trope?
Oh
But
no.
we do have tunnels
Yes.
under our school. They are real. And it baffles me that they think that that was part of the plan. And, maybe it was. I was not a part of any occupation plans, but there weren't enough people to occupy all of the
No.
buildings. That would have been impossible. They're also saying, like, and there were rocks that were clearly placed to get ready to break the windows. And
Oh, wow.
all the rocks that I'm aware of that were at camp were being used as paperweights for everybody's flyers.
It's really interesting to see university administrators and police turn into object-oriented ontologists, where now they're like, this rock, this is a very suspicious looking rock. It looks like its its agentic trajectory is going towards that window. I really, and this is a good reason to crack down on the protests.
Yeah. Yeah. So definitely a shift in how administrators are feeling about occupation and what's considered the red line, or in our case, a potential red line. The attempted occupation of our building did not begin until after the crackdown had begun, is my understanding. I was not there.
Yeah. That is really fascinating. I mean, because again, one of the things that you notice from reading through a lot of the kind of administrative statements that have been released in the wake of, not only just the arrests that we're going to be talking about in just a moment here, but also just the encampments generally, about the potential for escalation or for violence, or what seems to be like a little bit of rhetorical shadow boxing. Like, this is some perceived future threat that might happen. I don't know the degree to which that's been reflected in what you've experienced or what you've heard from campus administrators, but that seems to be kind of a trend that's happening across universities across the nation.
Yeah, it was the potential of occupation, and then also like the potential of an unsafe environment for children, which is extra ridiculous because there were a lot of kids at our camp, but it's because their parents were coming, assessing the vibes, and bringing their children the next day or later that afternoon because they understood it. They checked it out and understood it to be a safe and welcoming place for the kids.
Yeah, more often than not, the presence of children is usually, particularly with their parents, is usually evidence that the environment has been deemed safe. But, I guess that's in the eye of the beholder here. So I wanted to get into specifically talking about a real flashpoint that happened a week ago from the day that we're recording. So on the evening of Tuesday, April 30th, Columbia University and the CUNY institutions orchestrated a police crackdown. Just to be clear, they called the police on their students who were protesting both inside and outside of the campus grounds, which resulted in the NYPD arresting 282 people, was the kind of most widely circulated number that I saw. So what was your experience of this unprecedented show of force against peaceful demonstrators being in New York City as it was happening? What was your experience of this crackdown by the NYPD and college administrators?
Yeah, so the camp had gotten a notice earlier in the day that it was, you must clear out by the start of classes Wednesday morning. And so a lot of people, me included, assumed something would happen Wednesday morning. So, some people went home to get their things, intending to spend the night. My calculus was, I'm going to take the day off. I'm not going to go in, but I'm going to come in early Wednesday. That had been my plan all along because normally I teach 9:30 Wednesday. So I'll just come super early. I'll bring some coffee for the security shift. We'll hang out and then I'll go to class. But by that point, class had been declared online. But stuff started happening Tuesday evening. Originally, the campus security closed the fences and were letting people out but not in. And everything began from there. So I was at home watching on social media in a really intense stress shutdown freeze kind of situation. It was very difficult to function. It was just sort of glued to Twitter, Signal, WhatsApp, trying to figure out what on earth was happening. And watching your workplace, watching people that is happening, friends texting their birthday, and then that they're about to get arrested. Another friend saying, I'm turning off my phone now. That means they're about to get arrested. And that the jail support team has their information, but who knows what's going to happen? Are they okay? Lots more friends who weren't arrested, but were busy trying to help people, observe all of that. You don't know what's happened to them because they haven't been able to check in because they need to stay focused in the moment. It was really scary. And for a while there, my partner was in one room listening to WKCR, the Columbia Student Radio, and I was in the other room watching our City College campus reporters Instagram Live. And shout out to him. His name's Leon. I don't remember his last name, but the Columbia student journalists were doing an amazing job, but they had significant staff and it was just our one guy. And then a student reporter from Hunter who saw his Instagram lives and was like, he's alone. I got to go be with him. So he has a buddy. So it was just the two of them holding it down and they did an amazing job too.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Yeah. So that was the situation.
No, thank you for sharing that. I mean, I think this is, again, one of the things that a lot of the coverage has missed, as so many people are, talking about the importance of feeling safe on one's campus. The degree to which police presence just heightens the feeling of insecurity to such a high degree, I think is really important to emphasize here, that when you consider the fact that, like, yeah, you're getting messages from people that are saying, here is my identifying information. If I don't respond, it's because my phone is getting turned off, and feeling that sense of fear. I mean, I wasn't even, like I said, I'm up in Connecticut. I'm miles away from where the protests are happening, but I was also listening wrapped to WKCR, the Columbia student radio station, as these student journalists are delivering this kind of real-time live reporting. Specifically, one of the things that I thought was most notable, just to kind of cap on to this notion of people feeling unsafe with police on their campus, was that the WKCR correspondents were specifically, once they had gotten the announcement from their Columbia administration that the police were essentially going to maintain a presence on campus through May 17th, through their commencement and graduation, which now, of course, as of the time of this recording, has been canceled, the university-wide one anyway. And people were getting choked up and saying, this is that this is not making people feel good. It's not making people feel secure on their campuses when administrators do this. And I mean, from your perspective, as somebody who's worked in higher ed and who studies movements and organizing, I'm curious what you think the long-term implications of a decision like this might be for current college and university administrators. Like, what precedent does this set for the way that students interact with their institution's administrators? And how might this affect student organizing in the future?
Yeah, I mean, already we're seeing a lot of no confidence votes in college presidents and things like that. I think some number of them will end up resigning. We'll see a big changeover in leadership, and who knows what the impact of that will be. A lot of my students and a lot of my coworkers are really horrified. And I think both our president now and the president in the 60s have a reputation of being like more progressive than other college presidents and whatever. But in both cases, like they still made this horrible decision. And in a meeting on Thursday, the provost was like, yeah, once you invite the NYPD, you can't control what they do. And like my feeling about that is like, then that's why you don't invite the NYPD.
Seems like that should be a logical conclusion that follows from that premise.
Yeah. And like I'm the English major advisor. So I'm supposed to go to some like admissions things, admitted students days things. And we have one coming up. And like if the students ask me about this, like I don't know what to tell them. I like, how am I supposed to say that it's like a safe environment where they'll be welcome and whatever, and it's a great place to grow your skills in English and rhetoric when this happened? And now that's the case at, most schools, but I already get so many student essays about cops on campus and police violence and all of that stuff. And if you don't even have options for schools where this isn't happening, like for us, most of our students are definitely going to a CUNY, and it's just a question of which one. But our chancellor is in charge of all of those. This could have happened to any of them. It just happened to happen at City College. And I know there's folks who work in admissions who are like, how am I supposed to go recruit like kids in the Bronx knowing that this just happened? So I don't know what the repercussions will be, but it's certainly gonna echo for a long time, I think.
Yeah, I mean, well said. I mean, from the perspective of somebody who works directly with students and having to, it feels very unfair for, for faculty members or even people who work in admissions, like in that administrative capacity, to be basically held responsible for talking with students about decisions that are totally outside of their control. So, I mean, just from a sort of like shared governance perspective, like that's already a pretty big, like you said, no confidence votes are coming fast and furious right now. And I think there's that the reasons that you're articulating are probably a large part of that, right? Like this is creating so many more problems for other beyond just the kind of like, the horrifying ramifications of the action itself of, calling police, sicking cops on your students, getting them arrested, but then also to like have the rest of the college have to stand and sort of like explain or sort of like live with the repercussions of that, the kind of vibe that it creates on campus, I think, also speaks volumes about the way that this is going to, like at a systemic level, this is going to continue reverberating.
Yeah, and I think it's true that for every administrator that did this, probably many administrators would have done it in their shoes. And already at CUNY, it's raised some like recurring, but re-raised some conversations about like what are some alternate models for running a university? Like someone proposed that all the administrators, deans, provosts, presidents are elected from the faculty, serve on a 3-year term or whatever, much like department chairs, and then rejoin the ranks. And what if we did way more things via faculty senate or committees and whatever? And would that solve all of the problems? No, but I think that that would be good. True governance by the faculty, the staff, and the students as well. I think student government reps are often a fake amount of authority and influence, but like what could that look like if we actually ran our schools together and made decisions about what was good for all of us?
It's an important moment, I think, to start, as much as the phrase gets kind of like, poo-pooed online, start imagining otherwise of what could an actual alternate model of shared governance between, like you said, not only administrators, but faculty and students actually look like. What could a more democratic university, especially one like like state schools like CCNY actually look like? We'll get a chance to talk in a little bit about different actions that faculty members and other academic workers can and maybe should take in response to all of this, for those who are feeling fired up and feeling very much in solidarity with these movements. But I wanted to pivot a little bit to ask you, from your perspective as a journalist, you're in this kind of cool, rare position of somebody who not only teaches and studies rhetoric, but also somebody who is involved in journalism, in the actual, reporting on and representing different issues. So I wanted to ask you, because as I've alluded to throughout this entire episode, I am personally not super happy with a lot of the ways that these encampments and movements are being reported on. So I wanted to ask you, as a journalist, what are some of the most common mistakes and aberrations that you see other journalists making when they cover these protests and encampments? What are some of the key misconceptions, misdirections, or even outright falsehoods that you see them circulating?
I think the main thing, which many people have already written about, is the outside agitators trope.
Oh, yes.
My friend Julia, who's a social worker in LA, framed it to me as outside agitator is the flip side of the pizza party, because the pizza party creates this sense of like we're all the same, we're a homogenous group, we're a family, and so anyone who disagrees must be either an outsider or influenced by outsiders. But that's not true. Any space has enormous political diversity and all the other kinds of diversity as well. And this is some misinformation that we're dealing with at CUNY specifically on a couple of different counts. They're reporting, including the chancellor, that 60% of those arrested are not affiliated with City College, but those unaffiliated people include City College faculty, students from all of the other CUNYs, and faculty from all of the other CUNYs. But beyond that, like the ethos of the camp all along was like, this is the University of the working class of New York. The whole city is part of the CUNY community. Our union sweatshirts on the back say everybody loves somebody at CUNY. And while that's not literally true, it's pretty true, at least through 2 degrees of separation. And the folks at Emory put out a really great statement explaining how different actions by the university touch not just like their local community and people who aren't affiliated, see my air quotes, with the university, but like people all over the world. And so I think that's a big difference that reporting doesn't super get. I also think, and maybe this is a different vibe at different encampments, but the ones here in New York are, except for maybe Fordham, and I don't know about Fashion Institute of Technology, but like it's not just undergraduates who are participating, who are sleeping over. Like we've got a bunch of grad workers and adjunct faculty who are, I don't know about sleeping over, but I know student workers of Columbia members have been really active in the Columbia encampment. And there's this great photo from, I believe from Harvard, of a tent with a UAW logo on the side. So
Yes.
that maybe their undergraduates are, I believe, in the process of unionizing as well. So, maybe that's an undergraduate tent, but I suspect it's a grad worker tent.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
and so I think some reporting creates this binary between like student organizers and faculty supporters. And probably in some spaces that's true. And for some faculty, that's probably true. But I think there's also a lot more overlap in like who's really participating as a full member of the encampments is much more mixed as a university community than I think some reporting makes it out to be. At least that's been the case at CUNY.
Absolutely. Just to kind of go back to specifically, I think it's really interesting that mainly what we're sort of noticing here has been this kind of like all these different kind of divisionary tactics to kind of say that encampments or movements are made up of more than just this sort of like insider group who ostensibly belong in that space, right? Because so much of this is space and place-based protest, that there is this kind of notion that some people are allowed to be here and others are not, which, as you said, and as we talked about before, kind of contravenes the point of a place like City College. But again, I mean, I know this has been pointed out elsewhere, but I thought it would be useful to bring it in for the record here that, Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail written in 1963 literally calls out this trope in the ever famous injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Whatever affects one directly affects all directly. Never again can we afford to live with the narrow provincial, quote unquote, outside agitator idea. Anyone who lives inside the United States can never be considered an outsider anywhere within its bounds. And I mean, I think that really poignantly, just to bring it back to what the protest itself is about and advocating for, university students may have a particularly unique stake in this issue as people who are protesting, are sitting in, are, basically creating a spectacle in order to heighten the contradictions about their own universities or colleges' complicity in the violence that's currently being waged on Palestinian people. But more broadly, I mean, everyone in the United States is touched by this in some way, right? Like our tax dollars are what is going to fund, not to put too fine a point on it, but like, yeah, the bombing in Rafah right now is being paid for by, if you live in the United States, if you pay taxes here, part of your tax dollars are going to that. So, I mean, that's why, I mean, I think the outside agitator trope is usually a pretty transparent attempt to create this kind of like fictional divide between people who would otherwise be in solidarity for the same purpose, if not the same direct goal, right, of getting a university to divest versus getting the United States as a whole to divest. But the way that journalists kind of act as stenographers for that line, whether it's city officials like Mayor Eric Adams, who are, talking about outside agitators, or university officials themselves, I think that's kind of a dereliction of duty for a lot of journalists.
And I think like a lot of news organizations like have this professional norm pressure to present like both sides, and even just framing things as two sides really drives me crazy. But like an advantage like we have as Left Voice is like we're not a news organization, we're a socialist group that runs a publication. So I don't need to do any of that when I'm writing. I can just say what I think, present the argument, be accurate, and that's it. I don't need to ask the university for comment or whatever. No one expects that of me. It's not part of the purpose, which I think gives me a lot of freedom for reporting what I think is an accurate situation. Whereas having that expectation to present multiple points of view, regardless which of what you think, shapes the narrative, shapes everything as being like equally plausible, equally valid. And that's a structural issue within journalism, I think, and
Oh,
what's
yeah.
considered needed.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess just to kind of go along with this, one of the things I've seen a lot of journalists talking about in the past several days, particularly on social media like Twitter, has been the kind of journalists going into any given encampment and trying to talk to a random student. And the students are all saying, no, we're not going to talk to you. Or, like, I don't have media training. Go talk to our media representative. And that is being portrayed in and of itself as a kind of like authoritarian tactic. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, because that's been something that's been particularly bothersome to me that we've been seeing over the past few days. What do you make of journalists kind of talking about, it's authoritarian that any random student will not come up and talk to a journalist?
Yeah, I mean, I find it similarly frustrating. I was that person saying, no, I don't want to comment when I visited Columbia because the press couldn't get inside. So they were trying to interview everybody outside. But I haven't prepared an answer. Like even talking to you now, like I've prepared notes about what I want to say to make sure I say it well and make sure I cover everything I wanted to say. I haven't prepared an answer. And the media loves to smear. And so of course random people like don't want to put that at risk. Like people's addresses are getting published. Someone at Columbia like national media is making fun of her dissertation right now.
Oh
Like,
my
it's
God, I
just
saw that.
terrible. Why would you want to expose yourself to that? So the people who are choosing or being nominated to be the spokespeople, of course you want to be practiced and trained of how to represent the main things you want to get across in a way that will protect yourself and be the most like anti-smear protection possible. It helps you feel more safe knowing that. So I don't think it's an authoritarian thing at all. It's a collective safety measure. And journalists should know that and should know that having spokespeople is very, very normal for all kinds of organizations.
I was just about to say, I'm not the first person to make this point, certainly, but yeah, no one ever questions it when you have to reach out to a media spokesperson for a company that's involved in some kind of scandal. And you don't just go and interview a random employee from that guy. I know that these are not the same thing, but I mean, it never gets questioned in the same way, which I always think is kind of a fascinating false equivalency there. I was kind of curious, again, from your perspective as somebody who writes about this, are there some ways that our listeners can kind of inoculate themselves or people that they know against misinformed or skewed reporting tropes in order to maintain the frame on a kind of accurate portrayal of what's actually happening on these campuses?
I mean, I think my initial answer is really coming from a teacherly perspective of like, look at the primary sources, look at what the encampment people are putting out, go on social media, see what people are saying. Because, well, I'm sure some people aren't posting about it as much for the same smear fears. Like, lots of people are posting, both outside people like journalists and politicians who are visiting and whatever, but also like lots of professors have been tweeting like, I went to the encampment at my school, here's what I saw. That kind of direct experience reporting like shows you what people are saying and doing and feeling and experiencing. And while there's certainly like provocateurs who go and do like gotcha stuff and whatever, look at the comments on that and how people are contextualizing those kinds of things. Social media is difficult in so many ways, but really useful in that it helps you get a more complete picture of a situation if you bother clicking on enough things that you can see what lots of different kinds of people are saying about something. And so certainly when I was emailing my students, I was like, check out our student newspaper reporting. And that's another thing I would say is go and see what the student journalists are saying.
Oh, yes.
And here's the link to the encampment Instagram. And for us, we had a City College alum who's a journalist who is like not live tweeting, but tweeting regularly throughout the day of what was going on at camp. So I linked them to that as well. Like, here's a guy who's has his connection. He's an alum of the school, and he's been posting a lot of photos and videos and things of like what's been going on. See it with your own eyes, especially now when we have photos and videos in abundance, even if they don't all have like, people's faces, and not wanting to show your face is also very understandable in this environment. But there's so many ways to see for yourself, even if you can't visit or don't want to visit, like what is happening, and do that instead of reading the news.
Yeah, incredibly well said. For me, that's one of the more baffling things is that people are, I mean, even the journalists themselves, like you can go out and look at social media, right? Like that, this is not privileged information per se. There are official channels where, like you said, there are encampment Instagrams for almost every single one of these that are constantly giving updates on like the teach-in events or other kinds of, like community dinners or, yeah, like Passover meals that we saw at Columbia and other places that are happening. So I guess I wanted to finish us out here with a question about, because we do have faculty members who listen to this show and other academic workers as well, what do you see as some of the best ways that you think other academic workers can help support students who are standing against global injustice, violence, and genocide?
I want to preface my answer with saying, even though I'm going to talk about union organizing, because New York City and New York City higher ed in particular is a really union dense place, that all of this applies to people who don't have unions but can act like a union.
Absolutely.
So in our case, our union as a formal organization has been more hands-off. They've issued some statements about like academic freedom and right to protest and things, but have not like mobilized people to attend the encampment, things like that. But we have various like groups of rank and file workers, sometimes organized as Faculty and Staff for Justice in Palestine. But what I'm involved with, we're calling ourselves CUNY on strike. We are not on strike. But that
Yeah, to be
formed as
clear.
a, yeah, Community on Strike campaign. We formed last semester as part of our contract campaign of like, we're not strike ready as a union, but we need to get strike ready as a union. And even though that's focused about the contract, it came out of Palestine organizing in the wake of October 7th is lots of people who were union members, kept up with what was happening, but weren't active, were suddenly like, this is the thing, I need to get involved. So we've always been really tied to the fight for Palestinian liberation. So we've been doing a lot of work to organize people as union members. So encampment started Thursday. That Monday, we had a rank and file assembly, which is the first one we've ever had. Probably between 150 and 200 PSC members came, and then lots of students from the encampment and just like people from the community attended also to see what the deal was and say what they thought. So we voted on a bunch of proposals about what we should do. Some of that was calling on our union as a formal body to take some steps. People are trying to get a resolution passed in our delegate assembly on Thursday to support the 5 demands and drop the charges, things like that. But then also things that we could do. We organized protection pickets, is what we called them, for Tuesday in the afternoon, just to show a union presence in support. And then we discussed doing a sick out for Wednesday, which was the first job action that our union has ever done in its 52-year history, because we operate under the Taylor Law, which forbids public sector strikes and has some of the harshest penalties out of all of the similar laws in other states. So that was a discussion that we had at the assembly as well, and a vote.
Yeah. And I think it's important to contextualize that, because the Taylor Law is a New York State specific law, correct? Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, as somebody who more or less fled the state of Wisconsin after they passed the assembly bill that under Scott Walker forbade collective bargaining, any kinds of tactics for teacher unions, I can relate. That is something that, before you are considering a labor action, certainly look into your state law surrounding this so that you know the array of tactics that are indeed available to you. And yeah, I mean, I just kind of wanted to ask, just as a follow-up, how do you see that as kind of like leveraging faculties and other academic workers, not only rhetorical, but also material power, right? The actual leverage that we have to affect a change in this. I mean, for listeners who might not have a sense of what that is, could you talk a little bit about why this kind of critical support at this time is so important?
Yeah, so ideally, a job action is really large across the whole union, and UAW Local 4811, which is grad workers and postdocs at the University of California, 48,000 members, is doing a official strike authorization vote next week in response to the really horrifying stories of what happened at UCLA. So that's like the ideal scenario of whole union mobilization. And if you go on strike, nothing is happening. So business as usual cannot function, and that wields an immense amount of leverage. In our case at CUNY, the threshold for making the stickout actually happen was voted to be 250 people, and that's like 1% of the union. So it's certainly not big enough to have a major impact on the material functioning of the university, but that's a political strike. In this case, mostly symbolic, saying we feel so strongly about this that we're going to do this really intense thing. So in that case, I think it's mostly symbolic in its value and rhetorical in its value. But like right now, folks at Columbia, at NYU, at the New School, and at UNC Chapel Hill, which is 30 minutes from where I grew up, so it's especially close to my heart,
Sure.
are doing grade strike pledges right now, where if they get enough signatures, and who knows, if they will, they set their thresholds internally. The folks will withhold grades past the grade deadline. Mostly, I think the demands are drop the charges and stop the academic punishments of everyone who's been arrested or suspended or expelled, and then to engage meaningfully in negotiations about the demands. So we'll see what happens with that and with 4811 and their strike authorization vote.
Absolutely. Yeah, we'll link to the announcement of that, which just dropped yesterday, I believe, that they are doing a strike authorization vote, the 13th through the 15th. Yes. So
okay, yeah, so next week.
Yeah, so early next week. But yeah, specifically, one of the things that I think they mentioned in that thread that also bears mentioning here is that this kind of thing, it can be symbolic, but it can work, right? Even the threat of something like this, they write here, de-escalation is possible. Brown, Northwestern, Evergreen State, Rutgers, University of Minnesota, and UC Riverside were all able to reach agreements where they made, even if only partial concessions to the demands, they still, agreed to bargain in good faith. And I think that bears mentioning that this is not just a tale of woe and despair and, kind of like flailing our arms at some truly horrifying things that are happening across the world. There is a real material possibility for success here, and that through this kind of organized action, standing in solidarity specifically with students, with student movements that are winning real gains and have that ability, is really important right now. So thank you very much for underscoring that with some specific organizing details here.
I think it's also important to note that even though for us, like a strike is always illegal as public sector workers, that these other schools are under contract right now with no strike clauses. If they were to just strike, then that would still be illegal. What many of them are trying to do is a ULP strike, which is legal when you're under contract under certain circumstances. But my understanding is that it's a vague legal terrain. So that's why you're seeing folks organizing as independent student workers at Columbia, independent student workers at NYU, because they're not able to function within their normal union structures, or else put the official union at risk. So these are also wildcat actions, and also beyond the specific bargaining units, trying to get many different kinds of instructors at the universities working together. So they're also taking a legal risk as well as a personal job retaliation from your employer kind of risk. And that's really cool and really exciting because you don't see that happen very often. And that's part of the framework of the National Labor Relations Act, is being really strict about when can you and can you not strike in a legally protected way. And that's been pretty effective in getting people to not do the other kinds of strikes, political strikes, solidarity strikes. But we're seeing at least some really exciting steps in a direction of bringing that back. So I really hope that both for Palestine and beyond this particular topic, that we see that continue to grow.
Absolutely. Oh, it's getting me more invigorated. I'm happy to say that through this conversation, I've come out the other side feeling better and feeling more hope than I did coming into it. And I mean, I think that overall kind of shows the power that having these kinds of conversations can have. So, I mean, we encourage here at Reverb, for everyone out there working at a college or at a university, you do have some leverage, you do have some power in this to affect, some kind of change, right? Like none of us individually can stop the bombing or the siege that's going on in Gaza, but through our organizing, we can affect some of the material reality of how this is playing out. So we want to just say once again, thank you so much, Olivia Wood, lecturer in English at CCNY. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I've had a great time.
Absolutely. And from all of us here at Reverb, stay safe out there, take care, and we will talk to you again soon. Bye-bye, everybody. Our show today was produced and edited by Alex Helberg, with editorial assistance from Calvin Pollock. Reverb's co-producers at large are Ben Williams, Sophie Wadzak, and Olivia Burnett. You can subscribe to Reverb and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Android, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Check out our website at www.reverbcast.com. You can also like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter, where our handle is @ReverbCast. That's REVERB_CAST. If you've enjoyed our show and want to help amplify more of our public scholarship work, please consider leaving us a 5-star review on your podcast platform of choice, and tell a friend about us. We sincerely appreciate the support of our listeners. Thanks so much for tuning in.